On Wednesday, Russia made a major escalation in its war not just against Ukraine, but NATO in general. That night, the Russian Federation flew roughly 21 drones into Polish airspace. And if you follow the flight paths of a lot of these drones, there will be a lot of just direct lines. This was a very deliberate attack, flying past many targets in Ukraine in order to get to Poland. Of these 21, only 4 were shot down. Most of these were in the area around Lublin, and most worryingly, they seemed to be targeting Rzeszów Airport, the main airport used to bring supplies into Ukraine, as it is right across the border. There were some conflicting statements from various parts of the Polish and other NATO governments, including the United States, regarding whether this was deliberate or not. If these drones were flown into Poland, again, 21 of them, on accident in some way, that would require a less serious response than if Russia directly targeted Poland, a NATO country. But this was, quite frankly, a very obvious probing attack to see how Poland would respond to attacks such as these. In the immediate aftermath, Poland activated Article 4 of the NATO treaty. Many people are familiar with Article 5, which treats an attack on one as an attack on all. Article 4 is basically just a consultation where different NATO member states will have to have a meeting to figure out how to deal with this problem. But watching the coverage of this attack left me quite frustrated in one way. This was treated as a new thing, as though Russia has never attacked NATO before. If this was the first drone attack that crossed into Poland before, and that's simply not the case. In this explainer for the New Voice of Ukraine, I will be describing some of the many ways in which NATO has always been being attacked by Russia. Going back years before the full-scale invasion, this has been an ongoing problem of Russia using direct, kinetic, violent actions against NATO member states, and how those NATO member states have simply not responded. If you'd like to support the New Voice of Ukraine, you can follow us at our site, english.nv.ua, one of Ukraine's premier English language sources of news, to follow daily, up-to-date news about Ukraine and the region. And if you can support us, go to patreon.com/NVUA. I guess where the best place to start on this is this treatment of this being the first drone attack on Poland. And no, this has been pretty consistent, actually. There have been drones flying into Polish airspace. Most of this was just treated as accidents. Perhaps many of them were, but a lot of them were downplayed, not treated as especially serious, and not wanting to grab the attention that this obvious show of aggression should prompt. And in fact, as I was preparing this episode about an incursion into Polish airspace, there's an incursion into Romanian airspace. A drone was in Romanian airspace for nearly an hour, while the Romanians simply confirmed that it was heading towards Ukraine and not them, and therefore let it go on without shooting it down. This has been a pretty consistent complaint by the Ukrainians that these Russian drones were flying through NATO airspace and were just allowed to keep going until eventually coming back to Ukraine to do the damage they were meant to do. And even with Romania, these incidents were very common during the naval blockade of Odessa early on in the war, when Ukraine relied on the Danube River and the Danube port of Izmail in order to do a lot of shipping. And Izmail was hit by drones pretty frequently, as it still sometimes is, and those drones have often flown through Romanian airspace. So no, this is not the first time. But there were a lot of other Russian actions taken against NATO members directly, not just on the way to Ukraine, but directly. And this goes before the full-scale invasion. For example, in 2006, Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned with polonium while he was in exile in London. And similarly, in 2018, there was the case of Sergei and Yulia Skripal. The Skripals were, like Litvinenko, defectors from Russia who were living in Britain. Only in this case, this incident took place in Salisbury, where Russian agents poisoned them with Novichok, and not just them. Novichok was distributed rather indirectly towards them, leading to other people being affected by the poisoning. But those were 2 cases of chemical and radioactive weaponry being used on British soil, on NATO soil, by Russia. And nothing happened in response. I'd also turn your attention to the town of Vrbitica in Czechia. In 2014, a warehouse in that town was blown up. That warehouse had weaponry intended for sale to Ukraine. This was 2014, early phase in the war. Ukraine was going from a largely demilitarized state to being at war. This warehouse explosion killed 2 workers and was tied to similar attacks elsewhere in Europe. A follow-up investigation over the course of the next few years concluded what seemed to be obvious. It was the work of Russia, specifically the military intelligence unit of the GRU, Russian Military Intelligence, unit number 29155, the same unit that carried out the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal. And this unit, 29155, has been attached to all kinds of activities in Ukraine, in Europe in general, and around the world. They are the Russian spies and assassins that you hear about. It's them. And other than that, throughout the years, there have been numerous assassinations, kidnappings, and targeted harassment of Russian dissidents living throughout the European Union, especially those from the North Caucasus, especially Chechnya and Dagestan, and other restive areas of Russia. But that's even before the full-scale invasion, when Russia was supposed to be at peace with NATO. What has happened since the full-scale invasion? Well, for one, these assassinations have continued, and one of the most high-profile examples is the attempted assassination of Armin Kacper, the CEO of Rheinmetall, the major German conglomerate who has supplied a lot of material to Ukraine. Thankfully, this assassination attempt was thwarted. It was found out ahead of time and stopped. But other attacks include electronic warfare. There has been an ongoing example of electronic warfare based out of Kaliningrad that is nestled within these NATO and EU states that has been used to disrupt navigation in the Baltic Sea, both on water and in the air. And the Baltic Sea has been very active with these Russian attacks, including another incident where Russian ships drug anchor through the sea in order to sever cables going underneath. Power cable going between Finland and Estonia, as well as data cables. But the real one that is most worrying to me and the most difficult to defend against and most widespread are these smaller, well, sometimes smaller, sometimes quite large, arson attacks, sabotage that are carried out throughout NATO. And there has been an incident, at least one incident, in most every NATO country, where what Russia will do is contact mainly socially marginalized people, poorer people, immigrants, including Ukrainian refugees, and offering them money to light a fire somewhere, deliver a package to a location, oftentimes without them really knowing what the goal is, and just accepting the payment because they're poor. This is something that has happened quite often in Ukraine and worthy of another explainer of these incidences of recruiting locals, poorer people, with promises of payments in order to carry out what they think are not big attacks, but when they add up together are quite a problem. And you can't really do much about that. Everyone has Telegram and other messengers. You can just handle it the way you would any other crime, hope that you catch them around the perimeter of wherever it is they're told to attack. And there have been a few big examples of this. The most prominent, probably, example of how this worked was the Mariwilska shopping center in Warsaw, the largest mega mall in the city. It was burned down, and Russians were responsible. This was on May 12th, 2024, though it was at night and nobody died. Similarly, there was the Deal metallurgic plant in Berlin. Again, arson, again, Russia. And these attacks have increased every year since not only the full-scale invasion, but since 2018. There have persistently been an increase in attacks by Russia on members of NATO, mostly in these covert ways. But we know it's them. But what has happened? What has NATO done about it? And not much. There have been task forces, there has been NATO cooperation to find out how these people are recruited to do the attacks in order to respond to electronic warfare. And especially in the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, there has been a lot of focus by the government on defending against these covert operations by Russia, because the Baltic states see themselves as essentially being the next on the chopping block. If Russia succeeds in Ukraine, they're next. They're the front line. It's been gamed out how this could happen. And in the next explainer, I wish to talk about that. But these efforts are all reactive. Russia acts, NATO tries to slow them down or stop them or avert anything too nasty. But what that amounts to is a one-way war, where Russia keeps on attacking and NATO just sits there and takes it and lets Ukraine fight the actual war. So was this attack on Polish airspace, which, by the way, did crash into a house? It wasn't just airspace. It caused damage. Was this the first attack on NATO? No. Will it be the last attack on NATO? No. Has NATO done anything about it until now? Not much. At least not much to directly counter it. And what can be done in the future, we'll see. Ministers of defense of NATO countries have been holding meetings. There's been the Article 4 called, we'll have to see. But the past as a predictor is not very good. And most importantly, if there is not enough of a response to this attack, there's going to be another one, and another one, more and more, until NATO is forced to realize they're already at war.